everyone, and welcome back to the YouTube channel. Today I'm making another recipe of pizza sauce. Now if you look in the old Ball Blue Book of Canning, it doesn't have a pizza sauce recipe. It has tomato basil sauce and it has tomato Italian sauce. So this is what I've been using, and I've been trying to modify some recipes that I found online. One specifically, I used one called Linda's Pantry. She had it all written out. I thought, this is great. It's got, you know, all the basic things that I would normally add to like a can from the store, tomato sauce, tomato paste, things like that. So I'm doing pizza sauce using fresh canned tomatoes, Roma tomatoes straight from the garden, and ingredients that we have on hand. Now we are adding onions that we've grown from our own garden. We are adding garlic that we've grown from our own garden. And last year I grew a bunch of basil. So rather than using fresh basil that's like in the Blue Book preserving or canning book, I'm using my dried. Well, it was fresh, so I have to look up the conversion for that, but I'm not using stuff from my spice cabinet up above. I want to keep it as fresh as possible, and I want to keep it simple because the last one that I used was quite complex, and honestly, with the tomatoes from the garden, I had to cook it down quite a bit and add tomato paste to it to thicken it. Even after canning it, it wasn't quite what I liked. I like the flavor of it going into canning, but actually putting it on the pizza, it was very acidic tasting. So we're gonna go with the Ball Blue Book of Canning this time and see how we like that. Now it's real simple. Tablespoon of oil, saute a couple onions, 8 garlic cloves. Now it says a 1/4 cup of fresh minced basil and some bottled lemon juice for your acidity so that you can do the water bath canning. So we're just gonna double that. I'm gonna weigh out my tomatoes. We're gonna start right in. Now I'm trying to utilize the oven the best I can today, and it was bread baking day, and I already knew I was working on tomatoes. I've had these sitting out ripening for a couple of days on the patio table, and it's time to get them canned. But I have done just straight canning of tomatoes for a couple of days. So while my bread dough was rising, I decided to go ahead and do my pizza dough so that I can not have to heat up the oven again later on to do pizza. So we're gonna use some of the sauce today. It's a good use of things. So I've already cleaned up, skinned a bunch of fresh onions that my son grew, and a bunch of garlic that he grew. And having multiple food processors in this situation work really well. So I've got my full 12-cup Cuisinart chopper. I've got my mason jars all pre-washed. I still have to like wash them and sanitize them. And we are going to chop this up, add it to our pot. I've got a couple tablespoons of oil in here because I'm doubling my recipe. And our onions, we're gonna mince those up in the chopper also. You're welcome to cut them by hand if you want. I cannot stand it. These onions are so strong, I just start crying. So you can see, like, this is just a little Black & Decker. They call it a Handy Chopper Plus. I picked this up after Thanksgiving for like $5 20 years ago, and it does a real good job of mincing it small, and it can do a better job than I can do by hand, and if my kids see those onions, they're not gonna like it. So we're gonna go ahead and start sauteing this just to help soften it. We're going to heat it until they're translucent or clear. Okay, so while the garlic and onions are cooking to transparency, I'm going ahead and slicing and gutting or removing the cores of my tomatoes. If you do this now, then you don't have to run the whole thing through a food mill later on for the seeds. I don't like seeds in my tomato sauce. When I do just canned tomatoes, I don't worry about the seeds at all because it usually ends up getting used in like chili or stews that any amount of seeds really aren't seen in the end, and I figure it's just extra good fiber in the kids' tummies. So you're cutting off that blossom end, slicing them in half, and then all of my scraps are going for the chicken. So after I've got my cutting board full, I just take my thumb through, or you can take your knife. Use gloves if the acidity bothers your hands at all, and get all this extra pulp or seed membrane out of the middle, and then you won't have to run it through the food mill. It also will not need to cook down as much because you're not putting in all that extra water content into your finished sauce. So it really helps speed up the process. We are in October in a couple of days, and we are also going into an 80-degree week also. So today's a good day to do some canning because they've been ripening up. We've had a lot of cool weather and cold nights. We've actually been running our wood furnace. It's hard to do this kind of work on a very hot day, and you know, in the anticipation of fall and doing other jobs, being away from home working, I want this pantry full, and I'm managing the garden, I'm managing the pantry, I'm managing the refrigerator all on the same time. And you know, today is just one of those days that is everything. We had milk to process, so we made cheese yesterday. I could make some more to go with the pizza for later, and we're just keeping on top of everything we can. That means using the buttermilk in replacement of the water in any recipe I can. And this has got to be the nicest pizza crust I have made in a long time. And it was simply from substituting that buttermilk with the water in the recipe. So I'm just going to keep at this. I've turned the garlic down the heat because they're almost to where I want them, and I don't want them to start caramelizing and turning brown. I want them to be disappeared and unseen to a certain little 6-year-old boy. So just to show you the mess that I've been making, these are all my tomatoes sliced. I throw all the guts in here. I throw my sliced tomatoes that are de-gutted in the food processor, and I've got the chopping blade on, not a shredding blade. And we're just gonna run that through. Here I am down. Now, if you like a chunky sauce, you can do some just on pulse and do just kind of a mix in your pot of some pureed, some chopped up. Okay, so all my tomatoes have been pureed through the food processor. I've gone ahead and looked up the equivalent for the dried basil. Dried basil, you want to do 1 teaspoon for every 2 teaspoons of fresh. So basically, I am having to cut it in half. I ended up with about a bushel of tomatoes. So in my pot, I've doubled my recipe to 40 pounds of tomatoes, a 1/4 cup of dried basil instead of a 1/2 cup of fresh. So consider that. I just put in a pinch of salt and a pinch of black pepper to taste. You can add Italian seasoning. You could do garlic powder, marjoram, fennel, any of the things that you like to taste. Right now, I've just got them kind of simmering together with my onions and my garlic. And this has been cooking down as I kept processing more tomatoes. So take this opportunity while that is cooking down to clean up. I have done dishes 3 times today. Breakfast, lunch, snacks, and then canning stuff. So now I'm setting into a boiling hot water of soapy water for my old canning jars. I pre-washed these real quick. They were very dirty. Our basement had actually flooded, and I had box particles stuck to my jars. So I want to give them a good once over again with just some hot soap. And then I'm going to stick them in the hot water bath canner to sanitize. So if you're new to canning, let's talk about setting up your water bath canner. Now, you want to make sure that when you put your jars in the canner that, number one, they all fit. I use a variety of different size jars, and you can see, like, here's a wide mouth jar. It's got pretty square sides, and then some of the older, real heavy duty ones. This is an old ball mason jar. Sometimes they say perfect on it. These are a really big jar. Even though that's not a wide mouth, they can fit tight. So sometimes it's hard to get 7 of them in there. So I tend to stagger my canning jars in. Here's an old Kerr. It says self-sealing. Now I know a lot of people wouldn't use these vintage canning jars. My mom canned. My mom gave me her jars to use, and I'm honored that I'm the only person in the family to have gotten them. I'm also the only person in the family interested in canning. I was even thinking and just telling my son, I don't know why my mom even had as many canning jars as she had, other than her tendency to buy, collect, and hoard, because I don't remember her doing a lot of canning growing up. We did a lot of crock pot soups and stews. We did a lot of ready-made meals, and I think probably the one thing she did can the most was jams and jellies, which are pint and half pint for a large family. Now, my family is a household of 7, so I take it seriously and I try to cut that budget as much as I can. So when you fill your water bath canner, other than the jars fitting properly, when you are actually canning, that water has to be at least an inch above the tops of the jars. So if you're doing pints and quarts, you don't need it filled all the way up to the top. It just has to be a little bit over that lid. So, you know, pints, half pints, much less water, much less energy consumption. I don't want to can in pints for our family, because like when I make pizza, I take a whole quart of sauce every single time. Well, if I'm paying for 2 lids versus 1 lid, they're not reusable. Keep that in mind, that you want to be canning in the size jars that's appropriate for your family. Where like my mom, she at this point in her life wouldn't be canning in quart jars. She'd be canning in like half pints for smaller servings. I make 4 pizzas at once, so that works out pretty good. Another tip is white distilled vinegar in your water bath canner. A tablespoon, a splash, and that is going to help prevent a white scaly buildup on your jars when you pull them out. If you've ever seen other people's pantries or jars in canning, it's almost a white powdery dryness that's on that jar. That's the hard water, the minerals and everything. We run a water softener in the house, and it still really makes a big difference in our canning. Let's turn this camera around and show you my canner. So this is what's called an enamel ware canner. They're generally 22 quart. They have a lid, no seal, no rubber gasket on the top at all. And you can see this one has been through war. It's got a dent in it from probably falling off a countertop at one point. You have to have a canning rack, and this canning rack keeps your jars off the direct bottom of the pot so that you're not in direct contact with that heat. If that makes sense, your jars can crack. If you're doing a hot water bath, you put hot liquid into hot jars. The alternative is people do what's called raw pack or cold pack, and you're putting like cold fruit, cold liquids into jars that are cold and putting it in a cold pot and then bringing it up to temperature on the burner. And then with your lids and bands, you want to make sure that you are always scalding them. It is recommended not to boil them the way that I was raised up learning. There are a lot of different websites and information, but like a USDA, you know, food preserving website is a good place to start. Learn everything that you can. I, over the years, have had lots of books, read lots of different website materials, blogs, and things like that. To scald your lids and bands means to pour hot boiling water over them. That is going to soften that rubber seal that's on the lids, and make sure that everything is clean and sanitized as well. That way you are doing food safety steps, precautions against botulism, you know, anything like that. We always test a taste test, a smell test first of any jar that I open from the pantry, and then also in sealing and putting them into the pantry or out of the pantry. You always want to make sure that that little button is down. If it's popped up, it means it was a false seal. It may have come unsealed in the pantry. And because we are doing tomatoes, you want to be able to bring up the acidity. So we are putting, I believe it's a teaspoon per jar of lemon juice directly in the jar as we're canning. And this is so liquidy, you don't have to worry about debubbling or anything like that. So I'm going to go ahead and fill this canner and get it on the burner so that my jars are hot. They're all washed. They've been just sitting here for a couple of minutes. And I have found that I can hand wash them way better than any dishwasher. And because these had like dried on cardboard bits from our flood many months ago, you know, in the spring, we had that devastating sump pump failure. So, you know, this was something that I put off until today because, you know, I didn't need them until now. So I'm really going through the pantry and organizing and cleaning out excess mason jars. We'll be switching to pints and a lot of other things later on in the year. But meat, sauces for our family, the quarts work great. So this is entirely the time to adjust your flavor. And if you find that you want it a little more salty or a little more sweet, you can add salt or sugar. Brown sugar or maple syrup are really good as a sweetener in these hearty sauces. You see how nice and thick that is? So I'm cooking it down to reduce some water, and you can see kind of where we started out. I'd like to get that a little more down. So I've just got this on a medium-high simmer because I've got lots of space in the pot. You'd want it, you know, more medium-low so that you're not getting splatter. And of course, have that lid off so that it is able to evaporate. And here is a neat trick. This is baking soda, and if your sauce is too acidic, that was the problem I had with the first sauce I made earlier this year. Followed the recipe perfectly, and it was just too tomatoey, too acidic. And my son said it tastes pineapple-y, and I knew exactly what he meant. If you add a half a teaspoon per cup of sauce, it will help neutralize that acidity. So I am sampling here to see what we've got. And if you accidentally go too much sugar, you need to add more acidity, so vinegar or lemon juice. That's good. That tastes more like pizza sauce now instead of just straight tomatoes. I was throwing in a pinch of salt, a pinch more of Italian seasoning, and it just took that baking soda to take it right to the top. Real good. Now, a thing that I will mention about canning is I have a U-shaped kitchen counter. If you have an L-shaped kitchen counter, get yourself a portable workspace. The old enamel-topped farmhouse kitchen tables work great for canning because you can tuck them away. They're only like 2 feet by 3 feet, maybe 3.5 feet, and they work great for canning. And that's why the old farm wives had them. It really helps open up some space for you to directly move from the stove to your canning station. I have my mason jars hot and ready to go. We've got our funnel, and a lot of people like to do a 1/2 inch headspace on these, which would be right about here. I found that with most of my canning, an inch headspace generally does really good. Then I don't have siphoning where the liquid inside of the jar ends up in your pot. And like I said, have that pot ready with a little splash of vinegar in there to keep them nice and clean. These have all been re-washed and hand scrubbed. We've got our lid lifter and citric acid or lemon juice. It is a 1/2 teaspoon of citric acid per jar or 2 tablespoons of lemon juice. So have on hand what you need. And this time of year, I'm finding the lemon juice is less readily available. So I'm shopping around to different stores. I am going between the national brand and the store brand just to make sure that I have on hand what I need, because I also have a young boy who's loving lemonade and he keeps coming to my kitchen and stealing my lemon. I have citric acid on hand in both the ball and in my cheese making kit. So if I run low, I can always use that as well. And we have our jar lifter. I've got my hot pads all out. As soon as my kettle is boiled down a little bit more, I want to reduce that sauce. You don't want a watery pizza. Basically, it's going to have a layer of separation if you don't boil that down. And see how that's bubbling up? That's not boiling. That is from the baking soda. It causes a really interesting chemical reaction. This is a neat science project to show kids. I had never heard of adding baking soda to my tomato sauce until today. So that was an interesting lesson. It mentioned adding like Worcestershire sauce or butter. So I thought, well,
we'll go with the baking soda because my butter is homemade from my cow and I don't want to waste that on something if it wasn't going to turn out right. And again, as soon as this is boiled down a little bit and my kettle for my jars is up to temperature, we'll start jarring this up. Now, a little tip for you, if you have the materials, you can put what's left of your tomato sauce, if it's not done simmering down and you've got evening things to get into. I actually have to turn this down so I can go milk the cow. We went ahead and cooked our pizza and had dinner. That's all washed up now, and it is time to take care of some other things. You can put your leftover sauce in the crock pot overnight and just keep that on warm so that you can continue it. You can get one of those great big 18-quart Nesco roasters, and that really saves a lot of time on the stovetop so that you can go off and do other things if necessary. The food mill does take a lot of time out of the processing rather than coring, seeding all of your tomatoes. I found it pleasurable for me to just listen to a show while I did my seeding because my holes in my food mill are too large. So for myself, I would have to turn around and strain that sauce also. And that strainer always gets plugged and slows the process so much. So here's a little bit of information for you from the National Center for Home Food Preservation. Isn't that a mouthful? Wow. But I find myself going back to it and double checking processing times because a lot of the information in my Ball Blue Book of Preserving is based on pints or smaller. We do a lot of big batches, like I said, because of the side of our family. And I am the teacher in the house. I'm the farmer. I'm the chef. I'm the housekeeper. I'm the milkmaid. So keeping all this information in this head is just too much. So I make myself a lot of notes and I refer back. And with my recipe, a lot of times it's a little tweak here or a little tweak there, and it can turn out different every single time. Like I said, that baking soda trick is totally new to me, and I tried adding a little bit of Worcestershire sauce to it. I added a little bit more, and I didn't notice a big difference. I added a splash of vinegar, and that mellowed it out a lot because honestly, I was adding maple syrup to it to try to sweeten it out of that acidity, and then I needed to balance that sweetness back out of it. So a lot of playing and tinkering with this recipe today, more than, you know, like a standard recipe would give you. So 35 pounds on average is needed to fill 7 quart jars or a canner full of tomatoes. A bushel is about 53 pounds. And I know that my son, I brought the tomatoes in the house in a half bushel, so I knew I started with a bushel. So the 40 pounds needed, I was definitely over that, and that meant for a lot of tweaking in the final because I wasn't just going for 40 pounds. I was going for how many tomatoes I had to process this day. So my processing times using my quarts is 40 minutes in the water bath canner. If you were doing pints, it's going to be 35 minutes, so it's not that much more to do it that way. Now, if you were to use the pressure canner, it's 20 minutes for pints and 15 minutes for quarts. That kind of seems off to me, so I would double check into that because that is at 1,000 feet or less. You want to make sure that that center of the jar is getting heated, and obviously a quart jar is much larger and deeper to the center of that jar than in a pint. Okay, so I am adding my 2 tablespoons of lemon juice. I really need to save my citric acid for my cheese making. That cow is giving me a good amount of cream right now because her hay quality's been very nice. So I have to make butter yet today and to make cheese. We used up all of our cheese on that pizza, and those kids like cheese on their scrambled eggs in the morning. So 2 tablespoons per quart. 1 tablespoon if you're doing pints. These jars just came hot out of the canner, so you want to work quickly so that they don't cool, because this is the hot pack method. You don't want to put hot liquid into cold jars because that will thermal shock your jars and you will crack them, and they can crack right open on your countertop. And I found the best way for me to fill my jars, use the funnel. I just scoop my sauce, whatever I'm canning, right out of the pot with the 4-cup Pyrex measuring cup. It works really great for me. Use a dark colored towel or something that you aren't terribly concerned about. And if you want to add salt to each jar, you can add a teaspoon or 2 of salt to each jar. I've already added it to my sauce. And again, I'm just filling this up to anywhere from 1 inch to a 1/2 inch headspace. I like to go right up to that collar area here on the jar. Look at how nice that looks. Watch out, that is hot. I just got a little splatter on my hand. This is not something that the kids help me with. This is a mom alone job. My oldest son, who's 17, can supervise the canner for me if I have to walk away. He's been learning about the pressure canner a little bit, making those micro adjustments. That's helpful because it's hard to sit there while that's processing for an hour or so in some of those batches. Now they say if you want to cook your sauce down by about 1/3, you'll have a thin sauce. And if you cook it down by 1/2 or more, you'll have a thicker hearty sauce. I would say this was somewhere between 1/3 and 1/2 of my final batch, but I had it simmering right from my first food processor full to help speed it up. Now before you put your lids and bands on these, you want to wipe the tops of your jars all clean to make sure that there is no splatter, no residue on the top. Some people like to use white vinegar, hot boiling water. You just want to make sure that they're clean. And this is a beautiful 7-jar batch. I'm going to probably get another 3 to 4 more jars out of this pot. Lids and bands. I've got them here in the pot, all ready to go. Just dab a little water out of there. That is my water from my tea kettle. I poured over my lids and bands to scald them. If you're new to canning, there's a lot of videos on the exact step-by-step of the canning process. That can be useful to learn and watch. Read books. I have a lot of different canning books that I don't even really use, but the basics are in there for a beginner. So now that those are covered, this magnetic lifter helps get them out of there, and I just jar them up one at a time. Now that liquid in here is boiling hot after simmering down while I was milking the cow. So you're going to want silicone gloves or your hand wrapped in a towel to pick that up to tighten your bands. Remember, finger tight. You're not trying to really wrench on it. An interesting thing about me and my canning is I never canned with my mother, and that's why I said it's surprising to me that my mom had as many jars on hand as she did.
Now, you just want to have your hand protected. Make that finger tight. Always load your canner by these handles in the wire rack. Then it doesn't get tippy for you as you're loading the rest of it. Loading the back of the canner can be a little tricky because sometimes the weight distribution is a little off. So a lot of times I'll skip to that center jar, like I said, or saving that center space for one of the smaller jars if I'm using the really oversized large, like Ball Perfect jar is very a big jar. So remember, your water needs to be hot. If you need to add any water to this, I reserve the water from the lids and bands to pour on top if I'm short. If I'm short, remember, you got to cover your jars at least an inch. So I'm going to lower this rack down. I don't know if you can see that, but that jar right there is slightly underwater, not quite an inch. Never pour cold water in here like that because, again, it will crack your jars. So that looks better. We're going to go ahead, turn the heat up on this, put the lid on, get it up to a boil, and then we'll start our timer for 40 minutes once we hear that boiling. So in canning, sometimes you have to go with the flow. I had forgot to reset the water softener after we had lost power the other day, and that vinegar didn't do the job as anticipated. It's brushing off pretty easily, so these will all get a good wipe before they go in the pantry. So I ended up having enough sauce out of that bushel of tomatoes for 10 1-quart jars of sauce after taking some out for pizza and everything. Lots of taste testing going on, and that's a really good yield. I am very happy with it. I'm happy with the family for working in the garden, my son Murdoch for growing the tomatoes, for weeding, and he's been harvesting them and bringing them up to me as we can. I've got a whole nother bushel waiting for me that he picked yesterday. So I'm going to leave you with this video with the playlist. Go ahead and watch some more canning. Watch whatever homesteading. You can check out the cow out in the barn and our whole milk process because we talked about that today too. And I'll see you all next time. I got to get to work. Bye.